Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about Marilyn Monroe being the first woman to start her own production company. Now, this rumor first picked up steam in the 2010s, thanks in large part to fan communities making memes stating that Marilyn was the first woman to start her own production company back in 1955. This rumor has since shifted to one of the first, as people brought up the likes of Mary Pickford and Lucille Ball starting their own companies well before Marilyn. But was she one of the first? Is she the third? In short, no. She wasn't one of the 10th, 20th, or even 50th women to start their own production company. There's a lot of nuance with this topic and what actually constitutes a production company. To keep things simple, I've divided companies into three distinct types: studios, independent production companies, and dependent production companies. Let's get started. When many people think of a production company, they're actually thinking of a studio. A studio in this era owned its own lots and hired directors, actors, crew members, screenwriters, anyone you can think of connected to the film industry who worked around the clock to create movies. Studios also distributed smaller companies' work as well as leasing out loft space for smaller producers to make films. It was hard for women to break into this space after the studio system took hold in the 1910s. And the two most famous women to become studio owners were Mary Pickford, who co-founded United Artists, and Lucille Ball, who co-founded Desilu in 1950 and would eventually buy the old RKO lot in 1957. Studio ownership required a lot of time and money. Frankly, few stars got to that level of success, nor did they seek it out. For those who wanted more creative control without the hassle of running an actual studio, the most popular option was an independent production company. Independent production companies typically lease sets or filmed in public spaces to create their own productions. They would also commonly team up with a studio for distribution, with the studio either taking a profit percentage or demanding a flat rate to release the film. To illustrate this, I'm going to use Ida Lupino's The Filmmakers, Inc. Ida Lupino started the Filmmakers in 1948 with her husband, Collier Young. The goal of the Filmmakers was to produce, direct, and write low-budget, issue-oriented films. Of the 12 films produced by the company, Lupino directed or co-directed 5, wrote or co-wrote 5, and starred in 3. She and Young then negotiated a distribution deal with RKO for the majority of these films. Lupino's company went defunct in 1955, but historians still hold the Filmmakers' work in high regard, with The Hitchhiker, The Bigamist, and Outrage getting applauded for their handling of, at the time, cutting-edge themes without studio interference. Now, I do want to note that Lupino was extremely hands-on with her work. An independent production company didn't always require the star/owner to be this involved with every step of the production, and most weren't. Instead, most orchestrated funding and approved everything for the films they'd be starring in, including the script, cast, and crew. This is kind of the ideal for most Marilyn fans when they're discussing Marilyn Monroe productions. Marilyn's The Prince and the Showgirl would technically fall under this category, although the company was essentially a tax shelter after 1957. Marilyn better fits under what I call dependent production companies. Dependent production companies were the most frequently formed companies in the studio era by both men and women. They relied on studios to provide scripts, cast, crew, and sets with input from the star. On paper, these companies look independent, but they're more like offshoots of major studios. These deals were all nuanced. Some were a little more than name only to get a percentage of gross profits, but they're best roughly explained like this. The star would create their own corporation while still being attached to the studio. They may have the option to freelance in their contract, but they weren't freelance actors with their own companies. They were limited by what their home studio demanded of them. Besides Marilyn, the best example of this structure is Rita Hayworth. Hayworth created the Beckworth Corporation in 1947, shortly after the monumental success of Gilda. Hayworth and Columbia's deal allowed her to get loaned out to Columbia through the Beckworth name. This enabled her to claim a percentage of the film's gross profits while also running her salary through Beckworth rather than getting paid directly by Columbia and subjecting her salary to sky-high income tax rates. Hayworth would then pull a salary from Beckworth, allowing her to further pay less in taxes and earn more money. It's the best of both worlds. She gets a percentage of the gross and more creative control while also pulling her guaranteed Columbia salary. If a film flopped, the loss was entirely on Columbia, not Hayworth. The agent who brokered this deal, Johnny Hyde, represented Marilyn just a few years later. Marilyn obviously admired this agreement, as she wrote a note to herself circa 1950 that she wanted to create a company in the same vein. Unfortunately for Hayworth, she'd allowed Columbia to buy into Beckworth, and they essentially ate up her film's gross profits with some creative Hollywood accounting. This resulted in Hayworth suing Columbia in the summer of 1955 for lost wages. Marilyn must have watched this intently, and she decided when she repartnered with Fox in December 1955 that she wouldn't allow them to buy into Marilyn Monroe Productions. However, she kept the same basic structure of Beckworth, guaranteeing herself a studio salary as well as gross profits. When she partnered with Fox for Bus Stop, she was loaned out on paper while still being obligated to fulfill a 4-film deal with the studio. She was allowed to freelance as she saw fit, as long as Fox would approve it. And this is how we got Prince and the Showgirl, Some Like It Hot, and The Misfits. So with all of that, it's important to briefly touch on some of the women-owned companies before Marilyn's. Most women who started before Marilyn owned their companies during the pre-studio silent era, which was more woman-friendly than when the studio system was in place. Rough estimate would put this around 1900 to 1915. However, I don't think it's fair to use time constraints to ignore women's achievements in the industry. When you look at the likes of Gail Henry, Alice Guy Blanche, and even Helen Keller, most people don't tend to go, oh, they're from the before times. Instead, these women worked hard to perfect the industry, and the ripples of their work continue to affect the industry as we know it today. However, I know I'm going to get people who want to know exclusively about women who worked during the studio era. Although the number of women who formed their own companies went down, there were still many who created their own companies to protect their interests, including the likes of Doris Day, Hedy Lamarr, both of the Bennett sisters, Maria Montez, Jane Russell, Esther Ing, Alla Natsimova, Mae Murray, Gloria Swanson, Roz Russell, and the Talmadge sisters. And if we want to go even further with female independence, there were an assortment of women who chose to freelance but never formed their own companies, such as Joan Crawford, Betty Davis, and Dolores Del Rio. These women demanded and received high salaries without the work that a film company brought. Marilyn accomplished a lot during her lifetime, but she was far from the first woman to own her own production company. The main thing to remember is that when you view film history through the prism of one star, you lose focus on everyone who came before them. Women had a long and complicated past with the film industry, both before and after Marilyn started her company, and it's important to acknowledge their achievements.
You remember I told you about it? The Dazzle Thin Tower?